We now have the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. A very warm welcome to Sheba Chhachhi. Oh, very nice to see you.
Pleasure to be here.
Sheba, maybe let's begin with the beginning. I was curious how it all started, because you trained as a designer and then started to photograph the women's movement and became well known as a documentary photographer. I was wondering how you came to art, or how art came to you.
I was an activist and photographer, very involved in the women's movement through the 80s. The kind of photographs I was making was very much about representing the unrepresented, bringing the politics of resistance, of the struggle of the movement into some kind of visual form. I did this over more than 10 years, and then gradually began to realize that some of the intention of the work was to counter conventional stereotypes of women, the housewife, the jewel beauty, etc., or the helpless victim. So I was creating images of women in struggle, which by the end of the 80s had itself turned into a stereotype, which I perhaps had contributed to generating. And recognizing that actually led me to shift away from documentary practice. There's an interesting moment that I remember. I arrived at a demonstration and found a bevy of press photographers there, asking the women to pose in the classic militant image, you know, the shouting mouth, the raised fist. And this was being now performed as the valid representation of the women's movement. I started photographing women in this manner. From there I moved into a deeper reflection about the women that I was photographing. There were women I knew well. We were together in the movement, we were friends, we were close. And yet the images I had created in these years of documenting the movement actually didn't reflect their complexity. It also left no space for the ambiguity or the contradictions within these lives. I entered a collaborative experiment with 8 women activists, where I invited each one to create a kind of mise en scène, to choose objects, a place that would somehow tell her story. And we worked together almost 3 months with each woman, creating these mise en scènes, making photographs, looking at them, sometimes remaking them. And this was a shift away from the fake objectivity of the documentary into a quasi-fictional space. It was something between the studio photography tradition, the bazaar studio photography tradition, which is very much part of Indian culture, particularly this is how the poor usually relate to photography. I'm speaking of a time before the mass distribution of the cheap digital camera, of course. So this practice is somewhere between the vernacular, the documentary, and a kind of staged portrait. I would look at this as my shift into art practice. I grew increasingly dissatisfied with the way the photograph was received. It was a habit-ridden encounter. The photographic image was consumed very quickly. Often people looked at it. If they got the information, they thought they got the photograph. So I wanted to reinvest the viewing of photographs with time, which drew me into locating photographs in space, with sculptural elements, with text, creating environments within which I used photographs, which is the beginning of installation, where I continue that practice. But the photographic image is very often at the heart of my work, but I bring it into conversation with a number of other materials and forms.
So it became, the work, one can say, became more immersive. It became possible to enter the work, to
Absolutely,
be in it.
Because the relationship with the viewer was very important to me as well. So I think I continue to experiment and investigate new possibilities to open that conversation with viewers.
And what's the first installation where you felt that all these elements came together? Because I mean, it's all your early work, and you discover also installation, and you use video, you use sound, you use more elements. What's for you the piece where it came together for the first time? Can you tell us about
I think it's a piece called Nilkant, Poison Nectar. It's a video installation. It's quite a large work. It's about 25 square feet, where I used 280 little aluminum towers. Each one of the towers carries a photographic image of one of the senses, eyes, nose, ears, throat, etc. And these are arranged in a kind of mandala-like form on the floor, rising from the periphery towards the center, where you see a video projection in the center, and the four corners are one slide. The work transposes, uses as an allegory a fairly well-known myth, which is about the god Sheba swallowing the poison generated by the greed of the gods and the demons for immortality. For me, it's a perfect allegory for our condition, where we are in a state of toxicity, and we should think about how nectar is so utterly poison, how poison can perhaps lead to nectar. So the installation is to raise that question, and I think in this particular configuration of the photographic image, both in the towers, the front slides, the video, and the using, because relationship space crucial. I think this was a work that still continues to satisfy me.
When I read your interview, that also that often used this notion of intersubjectivity. And it's interesting, this notion also Tinal used a lot. I'm really curious if you can talk a little bit more about intersubjectivity, sort of idea of the dialogue between subjectivities.
I think this stems from a period of reflection upon my practice as a documentary photographer. I think confrontation, the power of wielding the camera, the kind of relationships I was creating in terms of the relationship with the mainstream media, subjects, all questions could have led in, say, the direction that other photographers have taken in the photograph, the souls is there. So working with women from different backgrounds, from different situations, was not possible if we were aware of the process of that relationship. I found my way of negotiating that improbable movement was actually locating myself, creating a space which lay between the subjectivity of the person I was working with and my own. So constant intersectivity, which was neither hers nor me, but together we could create something which would neither reproduce the power relationship inherent in image making, with one person having the power of making the image, neither fall into disavowal of the possibility of actually representing people who would, in conventional terms, be described as the other.
And that leads us also to something I want to ask you in relation to this, because we spoke about Delhi and your photograph Delhi in Delhi last time when we met, about Delhi, like everything related to the mutation of the city. And I was very curious because you very often speak about urban decay, you speak about death of ecology, and I was wondering how you feel Delhi has changed since these, and about your view to the city now, particularly in relation to the Commonwealth Games and the enormous changes there have been.
Changes at various levels. One of the things that distresses me the most is the disappearance of public space. As demonstrators and activists wish to occupy both club grounds leading to Rashtrapati Bhavan next to India Gate, today all protest is designated protest area in Jantar Mantar. So if we speak in fact of public interventions or public art now, we need to seriously address the question of what has happened to public space, which is increasingly policed, owned, controlled. So that's one thing that I see as a huge shift in the way one inhabits or occupies the city. There is equally disenfranchisement of people who would occupy streets, whether street vendors, street hawkers. There's an amazing order from the High Court which says that if food is sold on the street, it must be cooked elsewhere, put into plastic bags, and then sold on the street. I mean, if you want to develop a cholera epidemic, this would be your plan. It's extraordinary. So there is this points to a kind of fantasy of the city which is often declared to be that of Singapore. So a city that is middle class, sterile, clean, with all oppositional, marginal, poor, different elements safely cordoned off and policed away. The Commonwealth Games is an extraordinary example of in fact turning all of us into the city into Nilkant, who has to swallow the poison generated by greed. The city was dug up and huge craters left everywhere, which filled with water, and we suffered one of the worst dengue epidemics, with almost every person going through a potentially fatal fever. I could go on, I can rant a lot about the Commonwealth Games, but perhaps I'll stop here.
But maybe, because we spoke a lot also about the city and about this idea of maybe the artist as an urbanist and also production of reality, I was kind of wondering if you had any projects for public space and realized or unrealized?
It is an area of interest to me, and in my practice I'm moving more and more towards public art interventions. I've done several projects over the years. The first, which is 99 to 2000, I think, if I remember the date correctly, was an intervention on the highway leading out from Delhi to Jaipur as a petrol pump, where an artist group had proposed a kind of white cube and invited different artists every month to relate to that situation as they will. The first thing I did was to make that cube translucent. In my interviews in that period with women about occupying public space, I found that the crucial issue was not sexual harassment, which I expected, but in fact the absence of toilets. And that tied in with the sexualized male gaze as well. So what I created there was a kind of fantasy toilet. The place was 99% male audience, a trucker stop, where there were two doors in this luminous reddish-looking cube, one marked men and one marked women. The primarily male audience would very carefully go through the door marked men to find themselves in one space. And as they entered, they would hear recordings of women talking about how difficult it is not to have a toilet. These narratives actually cut across class, because whether it was a working class woman who would not drink water because there was no place to actually pee and therefore end up with kidney problems, or a woman driver who couldn't, etc. The sound has two layers. There is a kind of internalized voice which whispers about not being seen, which is what actually inhibits women being in public like Indian men do, with impunity and disregard or no anxiety. And the whole intervention was interesting because there was intense embarrassment, awkwardness, and then some recognition of never having paid attention to something that is so basic. The next work was part of the project which KHOJ and the Goethe Institute did together, called 48 Degrees. Because I have a fairly critical idea of what constitutes public space, I was interested in actually working within an existing public institution, which was a kind of public space which might have become moribund. So I worked in the Delhi Public Library. I found, serendipitously, an extraordinary space, which was a swimming pool. The swimming pool had been turned into a kind of dump for abandoned books and broken furniture, and was actually closed up and boarded over because the library was worried that people would see this and say there is neglect and dereliction of duty. It took 6 months to get permission to actually work in that space, and what I did there was a kind of mapping through history, through time. From, as you enter the space, you had this classic lion's head fountain, which I revived. It had not been run for 60 years. I ran it with black water, and as you descended along the floor of the swimming pool, you encountered huge piles of books that were tied into bundles in a saturated blue light. This is really going to be further and further into the desire to create immersive experiences. This was a very deeply immersive environment. Hidden between the books you find illuminated books. These books carry images which collapse together and bring into a kind of uneasy chiasmus images of the riverine cultures along the Yamuna with her condition today, which is choked with garbage, filthy, stagnant, etc. As you move down, encountering these juxtapositions, you come across a gutter which runs down the central length of the space. The gutter is a light box which shows a map from 1837 of exactly where you are from the old city of Shahjahanabad, giving you a sense that all the streets that you have just come off, which are teeming with traffic, were once waterways. So basically the work, which is called The Water Diviner, invites the viewer to become a kind of water diviner and to peel back the layers of history of water in exactly that particular physical site. The journey, as you continue, keep encountering various elements, and you come to an image of, which is a video projection of an elephant that is swimming underwater. This is a real elephant who swims off the Andamans. His name is Rajan. And the elephant goes through a series of transformations in this very pure blue water, imploding, deconstructing, reconstructing, as a kind of metaphor for the loss and recuperation of cultural memory, which is what the invitation that the Water Diviner offers.
Wonderful, and that obviously connects also wonderfully to Vivan's speech about the archive, the last part about the archive. And we spoke with Rax actually about archive and this whole idea also maybe of an optimism which is expired, maybe being revived in relation to archive and this whole necessity of archive, as Eric Hobsbawm would call it, a protest against forgetting. But I want to end with that question, the Rax question, because of this idea of India as a rising power. There is a peculiar combination of innocence and arrogance that can threaten our sanity. What are the resources that we can use to maintain a critical sense so that the footprint of this rising power is not a disastrous one? What would you say about that?
I think the image of India as a rising power is a limited one, produced by the media, by planners, and actually achieves currency and circulation within a very limited part of what could be described as India, number one. So I don't think it's something that farmers who are dealing with the aftermath of BT cottonseed actually subscribe to. So I think it needs to be inflected. You can't just say the image of shining India, because it pertains to less than half the population. I see many, many small, consistent acts of resistance, often generated by moments of crises, and these crises are not only continuing but accumulating. So you have, in fact, that that coming together of economic, political, and cultural forces into moments of intense confrontation happening in quite local ways. And this, I think, actually has potential for genuine resistance to this kind of meta-narrative of a powerful nation that's emerging, etc. I'd like to mention a work which is running right now in a shopping mall. A shopping mall is something that is very much part of this image of shining India, and I have, with great trepidation and very, very sustained reflection and thought, made a work which is an attempt to intervene in that space. This is quite contrary to the kinds of spaces I have ever occupied, so it is really an experiment, and I'm investigating what the possibilities
And
are.
it's on right now?
It's on right now.
Wonderful.
And it uses the language of spectacle. It uses the language of the new technology. It's an interactive video art piece called Bhogi Rogi, which means consumption disease. And it's about food. What I found happening in the shopping mall, which is a very powerful capitalist fantasy that is gripping large sections of people in the metropolitan cities and even in smaller towns, was that people actually don't buy, they eat. And the work is about food, and it's about eating, and it connects to a debate that's been raging in Indian Parliament over the introduction of transgenic foods, about genetically modified foods, particularly the GM aubergine or bangan or brinjal as we call it. And it tries to confront the viewer through a playful, performative format with a series of bodily transformations, moving from the very simple idea of you are what you eat to the kinds of poisons and difficulties that may emerge from the commodification of the gene, and of course suggesting that ultimately the human gene itself is something that can be replicated, and the last image is one of cloned babies. The experience is curious. I'm still watching and observing. The performative it's been shown first in the KHOJ workshop, where the audience was Kirti-gaon, mainly working class, art world students. Here it is the mall. It is packed. I mean, you have to actually try and restrict entry because people just crowd into the booth. As soon as they see themselves, because what happens is that you see yourself as part of video projection and then you begin to transform. As soon as people see themselves in the mall situation, and this is totally different from what happened in the KHOJ workshop situation, is that they say, oh wow, let me take a photograph. And they get someone to run outside, because it's a two-way screen, take a photograph of them within the projection, and then it's over for a large number of these middle-class people, richer people that come into this space. The difference in time is extraordinary, because in the KHOJ situation, people spent time, went through all the transformations, often 2 or 3 rounds of that series. Here I've put up a notice saying the duration of this is 5 minutes long. If you stayed longer, things will happen, and this has made a difference. So that quick consumption of even this experience, in a sense, reappropriates the work back into the logic of the mall. So I have questions in my own mind about what this intervention means. So of the huge numbers of people, I would say about 50 or 60 an hour, and it's up for 8 hours every day for a week. So it's very large numbers of people. I would say maybe 60% are playing, enjoying it, and it has been drawn back into the entertainment frame of the mall and of that kind of technology. For another 40%, something else is happening, and that is still exciting enough. So I'm full of questions right now as to whether it is in fact possible to go into the heart, into the belly of the whale as it were, and make an intervention which could open perceptions, open a conversation, open thinking, which would critique this ubiquitous presentation of India as a rising, shining power.
Thank you so very much, Sheba. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Pleasure.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
We now have a 5-minute